In this episode of Highly Sensitive Money, Karen, Kinney and I discuss our financial backgrounds and how sensitivities have shaped our relationship with money. We cover topics like early financial lessons, childhood stability, and the role of contentment and spiritual connection in our lives. The conversation also explores the challenges of transitioning from stable careers to more creatively fulfilling but less financially consistent paths. We reflect on the cultural differences and the perception of money between the US and Mexico, particularly emphasizing the importance of community and relational connections. Karen is a local artist and writer, and I'm excited to have her here on today's show. Karen and I met in Mexico City in person when she put together a writing group. A writing group on Thursdays, and I've met some of my favorite people in Mexico City through this group. So thank you so much, Karen, for putting that
me
together.
Me too. That's some of my favorite people. So yeah.
Well, let's start off with the first question. I'd love to hear, what was the financial background of your childhood, and how do you think being highly sensitive may have affected that?
Yeah, I would say the background in my childhood was very stable financially, but I think that's largely due to the fact that my father was an accountant and he was very skilled with money. He had a very strong left brain. And so I remember, when I first began to get a very small allowance for doing some chores. I don't know if I was 9, or I don't know how old I was, but young, that my dad had this idea. He gave me like these little paper cups, 2 little paper cups, and I was supposed to put like 10% of my allowance into the cup to save for whatever, and then 10% to like give to people who need help, and then I could spend the rest. And so that was like, that principle was instilled in me from like a really young age. And so, when I think of being highly sensitive, that's a good question. Like, how did that impact how I experienced all that? I think I took it like really seriously, like, because, highly sensitive people let things come in like really deeply, and they tend to be kind of intense people. And I am all that. And so I think I was also highly conscientious. And so I was like, oh, okay. Like, and I never did not follow that. You know what I mean? Like, some kids might be like, oh, okay, dad, and then they're just going to spend all their allowance or whatever. I was very like, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. And my parents would take us to church on Sundays, and I'd, bring the part that I was going to give to help people to church. I feel like that gave me a leg up on maybe a lot of people, because that's like a really early age to have those things. But, well, and maybe we can talk about this later. I've never been interested in money. I'll say that. So that's been throughout my life. I've never been driven by money accumulation. So that makes me feel very anti-American in many ways. So, when it came time to think, what do I want to do for work? Like, what am I going to go to school for? What kind of job will I do? I was totally focused on what will be meaningful and fulfilling. And money wasn't even in the radar. I mean, obviously, one has to make money. But again, the accumulation of money doesn't drive me. I ended up going to school for social work and knowing full well that's not like a lucrative career. Even in that career, the wage, I mean, it's ironic. You make more money by moving away from the people you're trying to help and taking on administrative roles, right? So I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. The most meaningful work to me is direct contact with people who need help. And that was always paid the least amount.
I love what you said about highly sensitive people sometimes like taking things very seriously, kind of like, especially if it's like it's your father and you're little and like they're giving you this thing that's a big deal because he's taking his time out of his routine. Like it's a beautiful story. And congratulations on having had that, because it does, like, everybody gets taught so differently about money, and like you said, that did set you up for how to live in our current society that's very individualistic, right?
Yeah, I was fortunate in that, like, my dad, he was very, like I said, he was an accountant. He was very skilled with like investing money, like, because he was interested in all that. But he also had he has a very strong spiritual side and was very interested in, he felt like it was part of his responsibility to give away, because he was skilled at making money, to give away the money he was skilled to make. That's just who he is. So I think that was also valuable. It counters, the excesses of capitalism and the ills that go with it, greed and all of that. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think that was valuable. I think another thing I picked up from him was like detachment, like healthy detachment with money. Like it's not an emotional thing. Like for me, I find what I took, I'm assuming I learned these things in childhood, like money, I do better with it when it's an objective, factual, like let's look at the facts instead of getting emotionally entangled in it. Because it's when we get emotionally entangled, like you can't see very clearly. It's not necessarily the best place to make decisions from, I think, with money. So I think and maybe that helped me as an HSP too, to learn a bit of healthy detachment because HSPs feel things so deeply and experience life so deeply that can lead to over attaching to lots of things. And I know that hasn't served me well, when I look at the scope of my life. But anyway.
That is, and it's easier. It is definitely easier to be detached from money when it's stable,
Yes.
right? The
Yes.
more
It's a good
stability
point.
the
Yes.
more, right. So you had that as part of your background,
Yeah.
as your childhood. What about your mother's relationship to money? How did you see that? How may that continue to impact
Yeah.
you
I think
today?
she was well, both my parents were pretty frugal. So they typically they lived within their means. I mean, they weren't, like overspenders or, the whole other side of money for people that come from that background where money can be an addiction or, so they were very pragmatic. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're from the Midwest, our family. It's a very pragmatic part of the country, very sensible. And I think that kind of played into her approach to money too. But she was a little more, I think for her, what I noticed, and I had discussions with her about this, I saw her more correcting from how she was raised. She was raised, my grandmother lived through the Depression. And
Mm-hmm.
so it was like extreme frugality in my mother's house growing up because when you live through the Depression, I mean, that's a it's scarring experience, and it's such extreme lack. And so I think for her, I mean, I don't know. She never said this directly to me, but my observation is she also practiced allowing herself to enjoy like spending money sometimes, to not be so like tight fisted that you feel guilty every time you just buy something for fun. I think I saw her consciously trying to establish a different relationship with money in that way. Because my sense is that her experience from my grandmother in that home was everything was penny pinching all the time, and that's like an exhausting way to live too. So yes, it was measured pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
If I put those two words together, yeah,
Yeah.
that would be my assessment. Because when I think about myself today, what are the strengths I have, what are my growth areas with money, I think I've grown a lot in it, but I'm aware of it, the whole being able to enjoy money. That I would label that as still kind of a growth edge for me in terms of not when there is money, you know what I mean? When you have some savings and you've kind of been as
Mm-hmm.
responsible as you can be and that kind of thing. I veer towards the excessive responsibility side, and my growth edge is learning to enjoy and maybe loosen a little bit in terms of my relationship with money. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that can be, I mean, I remember hearing once that like what brought you here can't take you there. Like what brought you to your current financial stability. If you want to change your relationship with money, there's things that need to change internally. Like it's always an internal transformation before you see the change outwardly.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really good. I think that's very true, and I forget that sometimes. I'm like, oh, let me just make the external shift without bothering to do, the internal growth. But you're right. It's the internal shifts that shift things in our outer world.
So you worked in social work and you saw that the further you were from the work that you enjoyed, the direct client care, the higher the income. And I know that from social work, you transitioned to being an artist and now being a writer. So I'm super curious, like, how did you, a lot of people are, like, we always hear about like the starving artist. For you being such a pragmatic person, especially around money, what was it like to go from social working to becoming an artist?
Yeah, well, there were lots of layers to unpeel. I mean, I feel like, well, maybe as with many people, a lot of their lives is spent, deprogramming lots of various things and then relearning, new things. And so that's very true for me. And so the backdrop of this, like I've been in a stable marriage for like a really long time. And So my financial picture well, it was one thing as a single person, and then once I was married, we joined our finances and became kind of a joint unit financially, and we make decisions together and that kind of thing. So we've had different seasons of that relationship where, early on, where I was working at some different jobs and that had health insurance and all that, and my husband was figuring out what he wanted to do, and then where he had those roles where he had a stable job with health insurance, and it's only because of that kind of shared scenario for my pragmatic personality that I then even allowed myself to consider looking at art and writing. And this is, there are some creatives that really make a very admirable effort at producing consistent, regular income from their creativity. But I find that that's very difficult. That's been my experience. That's my observation of all the creative people I knew in Los Angeles. So again, the reality, I'm my Midwestern realistic self says, okay, with creativity, you can make some money sometimes, but it's really not the avenue for consistent paycheck. And I'm so highly wired to have stability. So I think my creative life would look, well, it would be much more compartmentalized if, say, I didn't have a partner and we were having a shared financial picture and going through life together that way. Then it would just mean you can choose and do creativity at any point in your life. It just looks different. I would say in my more recent years, I've had more time to devote to it. But when I first began to make the transition from social work to art, I had so much resistance to so much about it was so different than how I was raised. It's creative path is unstructured. There's no one way to do it. It's not a clear definition. All that went against my linear left brain thinking. And so I started out by doing, okay, I'm not going to do social work anymore, but there's a lot of very part-time, odd jobs out there. And I probably have done all of them in LA. I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this thing part-time because that's like at the time, my mentality is, well, that's like the real, I had very narrow definitions around what is work. I would do that and then allow myself and some of the extra time to begin to do art. And it was a gradual continuum for me of beginning to own my creative self, to actually see that as work, whether or not you're making money with it or not. It's legitimately work. But then again, that's very anti-American too. Most capitalists, they don't understand that. Like, unless money's involved, it's not work. It's a very black and white. So it's been a long journey for me of deprogramming. Now that I'm talking, I'm like, oh, this is beyond childhood and beyond the Midwestern programming. This is like capitalist program. This is like, in terms of what has value, right? And what even counts as work.
Right.
So I don't know if does that give you an overview at least, or answer a little bit what you were wondering?
No, it definitely, so it answers how did you move from like a stable social working job into now working in creativity. You mentioned at the beginning that money's never been a motivator, so it makes sense that money wasn't like a primary reason to do any of this. Yet that pragmatic side, that desire to like stability continued.
Yeah, for sure. And that's just how I'm wired, I mean, there's so many different personality types in the world, but I tend to be one of the grounded, stability seeking ones. So, and there's different ways to get those needs met, but yeah, for sure. I think a big hallmark of my life journey has been about permission and allowing. And yeah, that's caused me to, well, just look at what am I believing and why, and what do I think has value and why or why not, But I think for sure, not being driven by the accumulation of money made it very easy to become a social worker and then to even entertain fields like art and writing, where income is very inconsistent and a lot less than a stable job. I mean, it helps. It helps to be freed up from, because at the end of the day, like, the accumulation of money doesn't satisfy your soul. And I think I figured that out at a pretty young age. So despite the messaging of America, anyway.
Yeah. I would love to dig into that more. Like, the accumulation of money doesn't satisfy the soul. And yet, anybody who turns on, like, I think it's like children by the time they're 7 recognize 500 brands. We are trained to be consumers in our entire society. I have this hypothesis that highly sensitive people see through it more quickly than other people. I don't know if that's true or not, if I'm giving myself a kudos for something that's not real, but I wonder how you saw through it.
no, that's a really good
experience?
question. I'm trying to think. I wonder when that realized, because I feel like I've had that realization for a long time. So it's not like a recent thing. It's empty. I'm like, when did I first begin to feel that? You know what? I remember this is sometime in my childhood. I don't remember how old, but when I had enough saved, I had my jar of my 10% savings, so then I could go buy, So I remember buying a CD. So that dates me. That was, whenever CDs were around, and I remember thinking, I think I had the money to buy more than one or something, but I just bought one. And I remember distinctly being aware, like, oh, I'm really content with this one CD. Like, I actually don't need any more. I don't know. It was an early awareness of contentment that it's like, even if I could like go buy more things, I don't actually feel the need for it. And yeah, that again, that was some time in my childhood. I can't name the year, but I have a clear memory of that awareness, because contentment, of course, the experience of it ties into being able to see the quest for more as the illusion that it is. So I think that also helped me.
Yeah.
It's like getting in touch with contentment at an early, that contentment is possible at an early age. Because, that like your reference, the messaging in America certainly never ever says that contentment is the goal. That's not part of the capitalistic cycle. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe it also has to do with like a little bit of a spiritual curiosity, right? Of like, well, what am I trying to
Mm-hmm.
satisfy? Because a lot of the times you mentioned that you like to do your money very objectively. Well, it's helpful if you have, first of all, stability, but also are taking care of your emotional and spiritual needs through other ways other
Yes,
than money. If
yes.
you're only asking for money
Mm-hmm.
to pay your bills, it's much easier than if you're
Mm.
asking money to let people know that you're a
Yeah,
worthwhile
no, that's an
person.
excellent, excellent point. Yes, and I forget that, but yes, people use money for all kinds of to meet all kinds of needs, and I think that's another gift I think I received from my childhood was a spiritual connection, a sense of spiritual connection, and so I think that for me anyway, that's been one of the most
Mm-hmm.
significant grounding forces in my whole life, and it addresses the concept of meaning and soul purpose and soul satisfaction. So if those needs are met, then you're right. Then it is much easier to look at money simply as pragmatic. I mean, it's a tool. We need it to live. We need it to survive. I get all that, but you're not as tempted to put all these like emotional needs on it to do things that it can't ever do anyway. But anyway, yeah. So it's interesting what you say, but you have to have some
Yeah.
other kind of center to be able to do that, right?
You have to be very clear on what you're asking money to do
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
conscious.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, I think one of the downsides of not being driven by accumulating money is that I've always felt like I never fit well, there are many ways I feel like I never fit the American cultural paradigm. So, because you're
Mm.
supposed to care about it like all the time with like everything you do. And, even in the art world, there were some public art projects I did that I made money for. It's like, yeah, you're making money for an art project. That doesn't always happen. But there were some mural projects that I really felt called to do. Like, this is something I'm supposed to give. And like two of them, they were able to cover my supplies, the painting supplies, but they weren't able to pay me. But I felt called to do it. Like, I felt like I know that I have to do this. And so when I've made decisions like that at various points in my life, I feel like I've often observed a lot of pushback from like the culture around me or people that are, because again, my experience in the US is everything has to make money all the time. And if that's not your end goal with like everything you're doing, like something's wrong with you. At least as an HSP, that's the message I
Mm-hmm.
internalized. So I always felt like kind of flawed, or like an abnormal, I guess, or like an oddity. I felt like an oddity because I just didn't. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I really relate. I mean, I grew up with my parents being really focused on upward mobility, and my parents immigrated, they were able to like get more money and have more things. And it didn't seem that they were the happiest of
Mm-hmm.
people around me. I've mentioned it in other parts of this podcast, but like I had an eating
Mm-hmm.
disorder. So I at some point realized that like the number on the scale didn't actually impact the way that I felt. It was never
Mm-hmm.
the right number. And I was like 14 when this happened. And I remember that also
Mm-hmm.
connected to money. I was just like my weight doesn't actually change how
Mm-hmm.
I feel, money doesn't change how I feel. Like And a lot of the times it's easier. It's a much easier distraction to focus on something
Mhm.
external than to like feel whatever it is I was overwhelmed by. So I'll speak for
Yeah, for
myself.
sure. I think like money is just one more kind of, it's a cycle or a loop that we can get caught in, that so many things that detract us from anything interior. It can be uncomfortable to look at the interior, because you might see things that are like, oh, I didn't know,
Yeah.
see that part of myself or whatever.
In preparation for this session, I read Doorways to Transformation. I believe it's your
That's right.
second
Yep.
book, right? And there were a couple of things that really stood out to me from it. One of them
Mm.
was
Hmm.
authenticity, your focus on authenticity. And we've already touched on this a little bit, but how sometimes people can use money to fit in. There was a quote that you said, there is a way that we keep moving in our culture that really doesn't help
Hmm.
us get ahead. And this was related to embracing enough and
Mm.
satisfaction. Is that how you would, the place where like you don't feel like you fit into to consumerism, to
Hmm.
capitalism, is that just like that desire for contentment?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think like, because I think I've observed, like, both in other countries as well as, well, I'll speak with other countries first, because oftentimes poverty you experience in other countries can
Yeah.
be it can be and look much more extreme than the poverty we see in the US, right? Because the US in general, even though there's huge swaths, there's plenty of income disparity, but as a country it has so many more resources than a lot of other countries in the world. And so when you look at, yeah, just experiences of more, I'd say maybe abject poverty is a good descriptor. I think when I've been in contact with those kind of places or had interaction with people who have like far, far less than I had growing up, but I've often seen, this isn't all the time, but often correlated with that is like a more happiness, more joy. Like it's kind of, you have to think about it. It's like, wait a minute, I'm coming from the land of excess, the US, but I would say it's a spiritually poor country. There's a lot of mental illness, depression, all the gun violence. I mean, I won't go into all that, but all kinds of symptoms that show that it's not a very healthy country when it comes to like mental health. But yet we have like material excess.
Mm-hmm.
It's not divided evenly across the board, but the country has material surplus, and then you go to countries where that's not true, but yet you find a generally what appears to be a happier population. You have to think about that. I feel, for me, it's another clue and another indicator that, oh, that's right. Like, excessive money and the accumulation of it doesn't meet our soul's needs, and in fact, maybe does us a disservice. So, yeah.
It may do us a disservice. Can you elaborate
Yeah,
on
just
that?
because if, say, you end up arranging your life around the pursuit of money and the pursuit of more, it can lead down a dark hole. I mean, whether or not you ever gain awareness that this accumulation of more is not addressing your soul's needs, or it's not giving you more joy or more peace or more, the inner qualities
Mm-hmm.
that kind of relate to meaning of life. It doesn't connect us more deeply to other people. It becomes an illusion that, oh, money will do all these things for me, but then it's like,
Well,
oh, maybe it's not. Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if it depends though, because I know that sometimes I mostly think that everyone walks around with my spiritual hunger, and then as I'm learning as a highly sensitive person, I'm like, not
Yes.
really. I have needs. I have sensitivities that other people
Yes.
don't
Yeah,
have.
for sure. I mean, I think it impacts everyone differently. And so maybe this should be, well, as your podcast is for the highly sensitive person, maybe people who have those traits
Mm-hmm.
are going to be more sensitive to this. Because you're right. I mean, I forget that as well. Like, a lot of people don't walk around with any great degree of self awareness or any really quest for the deeper interior meaning of life. For some people, maybe I think actually probably a lot of people are kind of fine with the status quo, or they're not driven to live and examine life. And I forget about that part of the population because I'm like, of course I'm going to live and examine life. Why would one not do that?
And I always remember that, like, I remember hearing somewhere that people who examine themselves
Mm-hmm.
more often tend to be more
Mm-hmm.
critical. They tend to be
Mm.
more unhappy. But I also feel that at
Mm-hmm.
least for myself, I know it's like I have a wide range of
Mm-hmm.
emotions. Well, and we touched on it briefly at the beginning that
Mm-hmm.
we met in Mexico. So I'd love to talk about how you experienced, you've changed very widely geographically from
Mm-hmm.
growing up in the Midwest
Okay.
to living
Mm-hmm.
decades, I
Yeah, in
believe, in
California. Yeah, both
LA,
north and south. Mm-hmm.
both north and south. And now you lived in San Miguel de Allende for
Mm-hmm.
about five
Mm-hmm.
years. Now you're in Mexico City. I'd love to hear like what for you personally, what were your experiences of money like in those
Mm.
geographic regions?
Yeah, well, San Miguel was probably the most transformative, only because Mexico City and where I live in Mexico City, which you know where that is, which is full of foreigners. It, yes, it's Mexico, but there's also a lot of similarities to LA. Whereas living in San Miguel felt like a
Mm.
really different experience because it's a very small town, so it's a pueblo, and you also have there a lot of contrast. You have a lot of extreme wealth, both from wealthy Mexican people from other parts of Mexico that have like second homes there, and then wealthy foreigners. And then you also have a lot of poverty. So you have those, you see that visually. But yeah, I think, gosh, well, it just moving to San Miguel just like completely like ratcheted up the contentment level because I feel like I had
Mm.
such an intense experience of like soul satisfaction upon moving there that was related to everything but money, related to like really good food and like connections with people around me and people that I just met being like, hey, come over for dinner next week. I was like, what? I just met you, Constant relational connection, which is again a strong soul. I have a soul need for that, but it's a human need. I had actually found LA was a very difficult place for me to connect deeply to people in the way I enjoy. So to have that, you know, the constant relational connection and feeling part of community was really transformative. It just puts everything else in perspective, including like consuming, buying things and money and that. If you didn't see those things as being somewhat empty before, I find you really see it when you experience your soul's needs being met on a deeper level. Then you can see it. And again, I don't mean to come across as like, oh, I'm demonizing those things, because I'm not at all. It's great to go and buy something and have fun with a purchase and all of that. It's more just, again, these deeper layers that the HSPs are kind of more sensitive to. You just realize there's greater depth in other pursuits. And so I think living in San Miguel and just the warm sense of community embrace, again, just fostered contentment and shifted how, oh yeah, if I didn't already feel it before, I can see it now, that just having more and more and more isn't doesn't lead to happiness.
I'm thinking of this Rat Pack experiment, and this is very extreme, but it was the experiment put together by Bruce Alexander up
Mm-hmm.
in Canada. And he had these rats who were having a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of cocaine. And I'm thinking about how often people just seem addicted to
Mm-hmm.
having
Mm-hmm.
hoarding more money. And if these rats only had the water
Mm-hmm.
with the cocaine in it, they would keep using it
Mm.
until they died. In an alternative scenario, he created a like
Mm-hmm.
rat park where the rats had like places to roam, a place to take some sun, other rat friends, different
Uh-huh.
activities like a treadmill
Uh-huh.
for a rat. And these rats would occasionally
Uh-huh.
use some cocaine, but after a while it wore off. They had very full
That's funny. Mm-hmm.
lives. And now I don't know that there's a conspiracy theory, but like capitalism does require us to keep pushing the
Yeah.
lever, right? Like economic growth only happens if we're consuming
Right.
more. It only happens if we're having more people, having more children who are then also
Right.
consuming more, right?
Mm.
There's the system as it currently is set up requires that our desires
Mm-hmm.
always grow, which in fact, at least for myself, it's like, well, there's only really so much, I don't know, cake I can eat
Mm-hmm.
before I start to feel sick. There's only so much I can try and get before you start to, yeah, before you see there's no
Yeah.
gain in it.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think that's really true. And that's funny about I didn't know. I think I'd heard about the rats that got the constant cocaine, but not about the rat park. which I find funny for some reason. It's interesting even observing other foreigners, and by that I'll say people from the States. So it's the same. So we're all coming from the same culture that moved to San Miguel. My observation there, you have some
Mm-hmm.
people, because this goes back to your previous point of how, well, not everyone's kind of going around in life with kind of this deeper awareness and interior growth. There's a lot of people that aren't. And so, I described my experience of San Miguel and how it related to contentment and letting go of a lot of material things and not caring anymore about a lot of that. And observing other people who moved there from the States. Some people also kind of really embrace that, like, oh, there's a freedom in not owning as much stuff and letting go of stuff. And then there were other people who really just replicated their life in America. Like, that's why they wanted to move to Mexico, because it's more affordable for them to do it here than wherever they were in the States. And then so they'll buy have a big mansion and do all the things that maybe they were doing in the US, but they can do it on a bigger scale. So in that sense, it's like, okay, not everyone like moves to a small Mexican village and is just like, oh my God, I'm content and I'm happy, all these things. Like, to your point, like, so it's just kind of interesting human behavior, but
Yeah. Yeah. And interviewing you as a highly sensitive person and how you relate to money, your money relationship, it sounds like contentment has been a threat, like stability, contentment, maybe some generational wounds around your grandmother growing up in depression and how that affected your mom and how you learned from that. That's like a beautiful progression towards maybe more, honestly, more complexity in your money relationship. One other thing we've talked about when it comes to why we enjoy living in Mexico so much, I feel that some of it is really how the relational aspect of this culture that's much more focused on being well connected and being
yeah.
part of a community.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's ranks up there really high. And one of the things I love about Mexico, I mean, there's many things, but that's like a huge one. Like, just, I feel like in many ways, Mexico has a better handle on like what actually matters in life, than the States, if I were to make a really broad generalization. But in terms of like cultural values, one of them would be exactly what you said, just people, like the emphasis on people, like people are the priority. And I've really
Mm-hmm.
benefited from that personally, just being in a culture where people want to connect. They take time to connect. They value it. It's not all about time and efficiency and speed and, don't interrupt me because I'm busy or that kind of thing. It's like, no, it's like, it's expected that you connect, that you
Mm.
greet people, that you ask how their family is. Like, to me, that just feels like a nicer society, and one that like warms my heart.
Mm-hmm.
It touches me. So,
Yeah, I struggle with it sometimes because I'm so driven around my work. Sometimes I just like pausing myself and reminding myself to focus on the relational. And I've learned also just like becoming more attuned to myself as an HSP. It's like, well, what do you need right
yeah.
now? And often when I need the relational, it's much easier to access here in Mexico than it ever felt in the
Yeah,
US.
I would say too, it's much more accessible here. So you can have as much or as little as you want, but when the need is there, you can access it. And I think for me, because creative work is so solitary, I mean, I spend a lot of time alone, like working, like whether it's writing. Back when I had an art studio, I was by myself in my art studio creating my art. So because the work I do requires me to be alone, that's one of the things it's been a nice balance living in a culture where it's like, okay, when I'm needing the human connection, I can just step outside my door or send a text to somebody or whatever, really just go outside. And this was more true in San Miguel than Mexico City, and you have instant interaction with someone on the street so it's nice. Yeah. It's nice to be able to choose that when
Yeah.
I feel the need.
And time is also much more fluid here. Like one of the things is that's an adjustment for that I've also really enjoyed is how spur of the moment things can be. There's not an expectation that we're going to know what's going to be happening in our life in the next 3 weeks, 4 weeks. That's not the way Mexico moves because there's so many things that are always changing. Things are
Yeah.
just kind of like on a case by case basis, day by day basis. And I'd love to hear, actually, could you tell us about what you were saying about half and half in San Miguel Allende, because that's such a beautiful example of like a difference in the US mentality and what happened here. Can you retell that story you shared
About
with
half.
Karen and I?
Oh, right. The half and half. Yes. Oh, yeah. This is so fascinating in terms of making me remind me that I'm not living in a culture in Mexico that where money is the top priority, and it's so refreshing. There's this little grocery store, tiny little hole in the wall store in San Miguel that carries a lot of imported products, and so a lot of foreigners shop there. And one thing that a lot of people, coming from the U.S., they like half and half for their coffee, and that wasn't being sold. And because there's other things that are kind of alternatives, but they're not the same. And so, anyway, an American living in the neighborhood decided he was going to get a petition of all his neighbors, and I'm assuming these are mostly also other foreigners, who would buy half and half if the store would carry it. So we got all these signatures, and it's a so American thing to do. Took it into the store and was like, hey, would you consider selling half and half? Look at all these customers will come and buy this product. Again, money's the bottom line, money. And the owner was like, I guess she listened to the proposal, but then I was like, no, actually to do that, because of where they have to get the half and half and what it means for the schedules of their workers and the delivery person, it would interrupt and make it more inconvenient for their workers to arrange for that to happen. So she was like, no, I'm sorry, we're not going to do that. So she put the needs of her employees and what was best for them and their lives above oh, I can make more money here if I have all these customers already waiting, and how hard would it? So it just fascinated me, because it was I've had so many experiences like that where money is not the drive. You think money is going to be the driving thing, or you're paying someone to do a service, and I'm like, oh, if I just pay them a little more, they're going to come faster. It's no, you can use money like that in the States, because that is always the answer for everything. It's not the answer for everything here, and sometimes it's outright rejected. And I just find that so refreshing.
Yeah. I remember when I remember, I think I bought at the mall and I didn't have
Mm-hmm.
cash on me, and the guy didn't take credit cards because he's a
Mm-hmm.
corner stand. He's like, it's fine, just pay me
Yes.
tomorrow. And I just walked, and this was in Mexico City. He's like, it's fine, just take it,
Yes.
pay me tomorrow. It was this lackadaisical part of it. And I had a taxi driver who actually
Mm.
undercharged me because we had a good
Oh, that's
conversation. And it's
amazing.
just,
I love that.
he just wanted to give me the friend's
Oh my
discount.
God, that is a totally good example right there. And yes, I've also had the same situation where I haven't always had the cash. I thought a place would take a card, they wouldn't, and they're like, "Yeah, just pay me next time you're here." That's happened to me multiple times, and I was just like, "What?" The first time that happened, I'm like,
Yeah.
"Really?" But yeah. So
Yeah. And it's so for myself, for both of my parents being Mexican, my dad actually really criticized this about
mm,
Mexico. He thought Mexico was very
mm,
mediocre, that people weren't
mm.
getting ahead, people weren't building anything because they had so much
Yeah,
contentment.
that's interesting. I could see that from that angle. Yeah, from an innovation angle, maybe.
Hmm.
It makes sense that people's life experiences are totally shaped by where you're coming from. What were you gonna say about your dad?
Yeah, my dad experienced hunger when he was a child. So he grew up with a lot
Yeah,
of scarcity. So his
yeah,
goal was definitely get a
right.
house, make sure that your children are
Yeah,
going to be okay. His goals were very let's get physically
yeah.
where we need to be. And I think it's kind of there's got to be a balance, right? There's got
Mm-hmm,
to be a
mm-hmm,
balance between
mm-hmm,
striving and contentment. I remember a mentor of mine telling me that people at the very
mm-hmm.
bottom of the income levels, of wealth levels, and very high levels of wealth levels, that they had a more difficult
Hmm.
relationship with money,
That's interesting. I mean, I would expect it at the very
right?
low, but that's interesting at the very high too.
Well, at the very low, because there's so
Mm-hmm,
much scarcity, sometimes it can feel like there's nothing you
mm-hmm,
can do to get out of
mm-hmm,
it, right? If you get stuck into
mm-hmm.
payday loans and you have a lot of people with needs who can't care
Yeah.
for themselves, then it can feel like a cage without
Mm-hmm.
an exit. And at the very high levels, because there's
Mm.
no needs, there's no
Mm-hmm.
material needs, there's no
Mm-hmm.
external needs, all of the motivation needs to be
Oh,
internal.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Internal motivation to
Yeah.
create and achieve. And
And
that
find
that can
your
be hard to get. It can be
Yeah,
hard to
yeah,
stay
exactly.
yeah.
No, I mean, it totally depends on personality. And I know people, well, in terms of the internally versus externally driven, I know people in both those categories. And the ones who need a little more external motivation, it helps to have a financial need too, because it acts as a motivator.
Yeah. I'm thinking of Buddhists who say that who pray for the right
Oh,
level of
that's a really
suffering.
good. Is that like a quote or something? Because I'm like, I really like that. It sounds like a very good concept. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't delved
Yeah.
fully into it, but that right level of suffering that will help you become
Yes.
awakened to
Yes.
life, right? And the Buddhist ideal of
Yeah.
enlightenment. But I think about that too for our money. Like we want a little bit of struggle, we want
Yeah.
some structure. And at the end of the day, that stability you talked about
Hmm.
growing up with, and that you've been able to really enjoy and be nourished
Hmm.
by throughout your life, it's
Very
super
helpful.
helpful.
Because I feel like you can't, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like you can't, the whole self actualization is at the very top. So you can't, like, if you're at the barely surviving level and need to get physical needs met, like, I mean, you don't have time or space to be thinking about like self actualization or my soul's
You're
purpose,
just
yeah.
exhausted.
So although, you know what, I used to feel like, I don't think that those levels of Maslow's hierarchy should be ranked in any way, because I just feel like it's all good. Each little rung has its own challenges, I guess. So to your point, like everyone's life and situation, whether you have the person, like you said, at the very high income level that has their own issues, or the low, the bottom line is we all have our issues and challenges. And I used to think like other people's issues and challenges were less than mine, or that's a better set of challenges to have. And I'm like, no, at the end of the day, being
Hmm.
human is challenge enough, and like just gonna manifest differently.
And we get used to new things so quickly. So in your book, Doorway to Transformation, you talk like the three things that I walked away with was like authenticity, being authentically you and having that
Mm-hmm.
be a goal, and
Mm.
also rest, really focusing on rest and how you're right that like you can sense abundance in the present. But I also hear you say contentment is
Mm-hmm.
possible in the present. Yeah, when you talk about authenticity, I love this quote. What if our only job on our journey of evolution is to say yes to our essence? And what if the weight of our becoming isn't actually on us? What if instead we are being invited to walk a path of ease? What if being authentic and listening to our own inner needs can bring us ease? And I'm sure, and I, as a highly sensitive person, I think when you were talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how maybe it could be like, instead of it being stacked,
Mm-hmm.
kind of be side by side. I wonder if it's just because of our very deep internal experience of everything all at once
Mm-hmm.
at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. Having any kind of, it's kind of like the princess and the pea, having any little
Yeah.
thing that's out, that's
Mm-hmm.
off balance in one
Mm-hmm.
of those areas is I imagine heightened by our
Mm-hmm.
sensitivity.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think life's, well, I want to say it's more challenging. I should rephrase. It has different challenges. Life as an HSP. And I think that trying to think how that relates to like contentment and letting things be enough in life, and when you're also highly sensitive and can sense anything that's out of place or out of order.
Mm,
But I think we have equal sensitivity to not only what feels uncomfortable or not right. We have equal sensitivity to what is right, and to the joys of life, and to those, for me to have that realization as a teenager when I bought the one CD, that, oh, I'm at a very powerful realization. I don't need to buy anymore. I mean, if I wasn't highly sensitive, I wouldn't have picked up on that feeling of contentment. Let's see. I hope you can't hear. There's like a pigeon cooing like on the balcony. Can you hear it? Okay.
very
Should I like
lightly.
scare it away? Is it going to
It's
interrupt
a,
the recording? Let's see. Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about, wanted to say anything else about authenticity. For me, like that's like usually a very high trait of pretty much all creative people. They actually value it quite strongly. But I never thought about its connection to money until you had mentioned that in one of your notes to me, that oftentimes people use money to mask who they really are. For me,
mm,
the reason authenticity is like something I've always pursued is because I'm an art. Most artists would be like, that's a very, very high goal, like it's a self-expression. Like,
for authenticity, I mean, the two books that I've seen, I've only read the second one, but they're both about
mhm.
creativity. And can you elaborate more on like how creativity and authenticity
Mm-hmm.
work together?
Yeah, I think at the core of creativity is, self-expression. And so I think for most creative people, tapping into who they are and their authenticity is a key part of self-expression. And I think it's where most artists and creatives I talk to, it's certainly true for me. It's where I find the most meaning, because I think creative people are kind of very sensitive to things that are, fake, or, there's a veneer of like an illusion. Or I think a lot of creative people and HSPs as well, I think, pick up on that. But I think authenticity is woven into the work of being a creative person, just because you're expressing a piece of yourself. And so if you don't have some clue of who you are, or some sense connection to your authenticity, it's like that's kind of some of the drive and impetus for creating. So they're kind of in tandem.
I know we've also talked about Enneagrams, and I'm hoping to have a guest soon who's going to talk about the Enneagrams and
Oh,
money, and how like each Enneagram does
yeah. I'd
money
love to hear
differently.
that guest. That sounds really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to his book being published and it being out. Doo-doo. Yeah, so when you're talking about authenticity, I'm also remembering that you said you
That's
were a
right.
type 4
That's
on the
right. So,
Enneagram.
right, all of the numbers are driven by different things. And I think the need to be authentic, it's one of
Yeah.
the one, if not the highest like key driver on the Enneagram for the four. So that would shift my relationship with money too. That's why I think for
Mm-hmm.
me with money, I've never looked at it as a tool to use to like make myself appear a certain way, because that I guess that feels ridiculous to me, only because like authenticity is what I've strived for my whole life. So I'm like, why would I do that? But that's probably directly related to my four and what drives me. So the four has the core need to feel authentic, to feel special, because I didn't necessarily feel that as a child. And so, yeah, so self expression is ranks up there as a tool for meeting those needs. So.
You've talked about like the money relationships that you grew up with, right? Having your dad as like a money model, and your mom too, her own journey from where she was to like learning to bring more pleasure into her money. For yourself, is there how do you I guess the question is like, do you ever have money stress? Or how have you dealt with it when or how have you dealt with money stress when you've
Yeah, I
experienced it?
think for me, stress around money comes when I think about the future, and namely like retirement, because it gets back to the question of enough and like how much is enough. And so I think that's where stress comes in, for me. And also because as I shared earlier, I've never been interested in amassing lots of money. So therefore, I've never been someone to, take classes on maximizing your investments and all these things that some people do, that are very, money, money savvy. But that's never interest to me. So because of that, it's kind of this conundrum of like retirement's a reality, and you need to have savings for it. And so that's been on my radar, for all of my life, really. But it comes back to the question of enough. But I think that's what causes me stress. And then, related to that with retirement is like healthcare costs. That causes me stress, because when you look at the broken healthcare system in the US, and how much money in terms of would you need when you reach a certain age, and then if you have certain illnesses. And so that's probably where I feel stress around money, is the unknown of all of that, and preparing for something that is unknown. Like, you don't know how long you're going to live, you don't know if you'll be healthy or not. That causes me stress.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very common source of stress, and makes a lot of sense. Very legitimate.
You talked about rest being important as a HSP, and then the authenticity, reclaiming our power.
Reclaiming our power. I didn't really talk about that because it doesn't feel as
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
relevant. It's like you never gave your power away to
Have
money.
I can't think of when I mean, like I said, aside from when I can get overly anxious, but not I don't feel like in a way that feels impactful to me. Yeah, so probably not, I don't think.
No, I mean, it's beautiful. Like it's always a joy to also talk to people who've had a very natural experience with money. Again, going back to when I have a friend who talks about like creating intuitive spending or intuitive money compared to how we do intuitive eating. And when it comes to food, it's not that hard to find people who have a relationship with food that's like neutral, pleasurable, or that's very much like a an appropriate size
Yeah.
part of their life. For money, because there's such a taboo about
Yeah.
talking about it, it can be hard to know who has, I don't want to say, I want to, like, who, it can be hard to find who has an easeful relationship with money. Not
Yeah.
necessarily easy, but one that like moves with the
Yeah.
flow with minimal
That's very
heartache.
well said. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a pleasure to hear like your positive relationship with
Oh,
money.
you're
Thank you, Karen.
welcome. Being the internal processor and analyzer of life that I am, there's all kinds of things, related to growing up and childhood that have been places of healing, places of growth, so but yeah, for it had just so happens with money that I feel like, yeah, that isn't one that I would say has been one of them. It has been more easeful, and I haven't thought of that word with it until you just said that. So yeah, thank you for articulating. I think that I would say that has been, for the most part, has been my experience with it.
Yeah. And it's helpful for others to hear it. And it's also helpful for you to acknowledge it, to be like, oh,
Yeah.
this part of
Yeah,
life.
yeah, you're right. Because I'm kind of one of these people that likes constant growth in all areas of my life, like all that I can put a lot of expectation on myself and
Mm-hmm.
pressure, to be like, oh, okay, this area needs tweaking. You can improve here, and a lot of that is not being very gentle with self. And so I think, yeah, I like that, just acknowledging parts of life that where there is more ease and that feel pretty good. That's important. It's important for me to acknowledge that. So thank you for that reminder. Yeah.
Yeah, because I had a conversation with, so I had a conversation with a therapist who used to be a social worker, and she moved into working more with money because she kept seeing that the majority of her clients' issues are related to money, right? To like just not having their basic needs
Yeah.
taken care of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know
Yeah.
where.
Yeah. I think just what you've said many times, the phrase money stability, that just, well, that makes all the difference for all kinds of things in life, and it's huge.
It's like secure attachment with money
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah. It's like that's a huge thing. Yeah. So I found that if you're able to tap into some kind of contentment around money and you're also fairly frugal, which I am, being raised in the family I was raised in, it's not that, well, it sets you up to find a more easeful relationship with money.
Well, thank you so much, Karen, for being part of this recording, for being part of this project, and again for putting together Thursday's writing group. It's such a joy to be there and to meet other wonderful women who like to write
Oh,
in peace,
thanks.
who like to write
That's
quietly
right.
together.
No, thanks for inviting me to chat with you. And yeah, I've loved that you've come to the writing group, and it's been fun to meet you there and the other women. So thanks for being part of my Mexico City community.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode in the second season of Highly Sensitive Money, where we talk about money, social justice, and how to do this well as a highly sensitive person. To learn more about my services, check out my website, allthecolors.net, where you can also find a really fun link to a quiz on money archetypes, because understanding our own patterns with money makes it much easier to make changes and get to where we want to go. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.